For years, a quiet property on the outskirts of Vancouver, Canada, looked like an ordinary farm. It was located in Port Coquitlam, a community surrounded by forests, mountains, and the rapidly growing cities of British Columbia. To people passing by, it appeared to be nothing more than a large rural property, a place where animals were kept, a place where equipment was stored, a place that blended into the landscape. But behind the gates of that farm was a disturbing story that would become one of the darkest criminal cases in Canadian history. A story involving missing women, unanswered questions, years of investigation, and a shocking discovery that would reveal the scale of one of the most serious crimes Canada had ever seen. At the center of this case was Robert William PICKTON. For years, he lived a life that appeared ordinary to many people around him. He was known as a farmer. He worked on his family's property. He interacted with neighbors. He attended local events. But beneath this ordinary appearance was a case that would eventually expose failures in the justice system and leave an entire community searching for answers. This is the story of Robert PICKTON, the investigation that uncovered the truth, and the victims whose lives became connected to one of Canada's most infamous criminal cases. Robert William PICKTON was born on October 24, 1949, in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia. He was born into a farming family. His parents, Leonard and Louise PICKTON, owned a large rural property where the family raised livestock. The PICKTON family was known locally as farmers. The children grew up around animals, machinery, and the daily routines of farm life. Robert had two siblings, David and Linda. The family lived a relatively private existence. Unlike many criminal cases that begin with obvious warning signs, the early life of Robert PICKTON did not immediately suggest the person he would later become known as. He was not a public figure. He was not someone constantly appearing in newspapers. To many people in the community, he was simply another person living a quiet, rural life. As Robert and his brother grew older, they became involved in managing the family property. The PICKTON farm expanded over time. The land was large, with multiple buildings, vehicles, and areas that were difficult for outsiders to see. The property's size would later become a major factor in the investigation. For years, the farm remained a private space, a place where the family conducted business away from public attention. The PICKTON family also became known for hosting events on their property. At one point, the farm was connected to a group known as the Piggy Palace Good Times Society. Although it was described as a social organization, the events held there attracted attention from local authorities over the years. Large gatherings were held at the property, and people from different backgrounds attended. The farm became a place where many individuals came and went. Among those who interacted with PICKTON were people from Vancouver's downtown east side. This area of Vancouver had long faced serious social challenges, including poverty, addiction, homelessness, and vulnerability among some residents. Many of the women who later became connected to the investigation came from this community. The downtown east side became one of the most important locations in understanding the case. For decades, the area had struggled with poverty and social issues. Many residents faced difficult circumstances. Some people disappeared without attracting immediate attention because they lived on the margins of society. Their families often struggled to get answers. Their disappearances did not always receive the same urgency that might have followed if the victims had come from more privileged backgrounds. This became one of the major criticisms surrounding the PICKTON case. Many people asked whether the investigation would have moved faster if the missing women had been from different communities. The first signs that something serious was happening appeared during the 1990s. Women began disappearing from Vancouver's downtown east side. Many of these women had connections to the same vulnerable community. At first, the disappearances did not immediately become recognized as part of a larger pattern. Families reported missing relatives. Friends searched for answers. Community workers raised concerns. But years passed before the full scale of the situation became clear. By the late 1990s, concern among families and advocates was increasing. People who worked with vulnerable women in Vancouver began noticing that the number of missing women appeared unusual. They questioned whether enough attention was being given to the disappearances. Some community members believed there was a connection between the missing women. They urged authorities to investigate further. In 1997, an attempted murder investigation brought Robert PICKTON to the attention of police. A woman escaped from PICKTON's property and reported that she had been attacked. Police investigated the complaint. This event would later become an important part of the case because it showed that concerns about PICKTON existed years before his eventual arrest. However, despite the allegations, the investigation did not lead to charges at that time. As more women disappeared, pressure grew on law enforcement. Families and activists demanded answers. They wanted to know why so many women were missing and why progress appeared slow. The case became a symbol of concerns about how vulnerable communities are treated by institutions. The investigation into the missing women was complicated. Many of the victims had unstable housing situations. Some had limited contact with family members. Some struggled with addiction or other personal challenges. These factors made investigations more difficult. However, critics argued that these circumstances should have made authorities more determined, not less. They argued that every missing person deserved attention and protection. Over time, investigators began examining possible connections between the missing women. The idea that one person could be responsible for multiple disappearances was horrifying. But as evidence accumulated, authorities began focusing more attention on Robert PICKTON and his property. The PICKTON farm was a major challenge for investigators. The property was large. It contained multiple structures. It had areas that required careful examination. Searching such a location required significant resources and careful planning. Authorities needed evidence strong enough to justify major action. In February 2002, police launched a major investigation into the PICKTON property. The search would become one of the largest forensic investigations in Canadian history. Investigators entered the farm looking for evidence connected to missing women. What they discovered would transform the case forever. The search revealed evidence that connected PICKTON to multiple missing women. Human remains and personal belongings were found on the property. The investigation expanded rapidly. Authorities began uncovering evidence that suggested the number of victims could be much larger than originally believed. The discovery shocked Canada. People struggled to understand how such a crime could have happened for so long. Many asked how a person could remain unnoticed despite the growing number of missing women. Others questioned whether opportunities to intervene had been missed. Robert PICKTON was arrested in February 2002. Initially, he faced charges related to the disappearance of 2 women. As the investigation continued, more charges were added. The case became one of the most closely watched criminal investigations in Canada. The investigation that followed was extremely complex. Thousands of pieces of evidence had to be examined. Forensic specialists worked to identify victims. Investigators reviewed years of missing persons reports. Families waited for answers. For many relatives, the process was painful because they had lived with uncertainty for years. The victims of the case came from different backgrounds, but many shared one thing: their lives had been overlooked. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, friends. Their stories became central to discussions about justice and social inequality. As the case moved forward, the public wanted to know more about Robert PICKTON. Who was he? How had he been able to operate for so long? Were there warning signs that had been ignored? These questions would become central to the trial and the investigations that followed. As investigators continued searching the PICKTON farm, the scale of the case became increasingly difficult to comprehend. What had started as an investigation into the disappearance of a small number of women had expanded into one of the largest forensic investigations in Canadian history. The property in Port Coquitlam became the center of national attention. Behind the fences and buildings of the farm, investigators worked for months trying to piece together what had happened. Every area of the property had to be carefully examined. Every piece of evidence had to be collected, documented, and analyzed. The investigation was not only about proving what happened, it was also about identifying the women whose families had spent years searching for answers. For many families, the discovery at the PICKTON farm brought a painful mixture of emotions. For years, they had lived with uncertainty. They wondered where their loved ones were. They hoped they might still receive answers. The investigation finally confirmed that many missing women had not simply disappeared. They had become victims of a horrific crime. But confirmation also brought grief. Families who had waited years for news were forced to confront devastating reality. The investigation involved forensic experts, police officers, and specialists from different fields. The amount of evidence collected from the property was enormous. Investigators examined biological evidence, personal belongings, documents, and other materials connected to the missing women. The process was slow and complicated. Modern forensic techniques were used to identify victims and establish connections between evidence and individuals. The case also revealed the challenges faced when investigating crimes involving vulnerable communities. Many of the missing women had lived difficult lives. Some struggled with addiction. Some experienced homelessness. Some had limited contact with relatives. These circumstances created challenges for authorities trying to understand their movements and relationships. However, the case also led to serious criticism. Many activists and families argued that the women's circumstances should never have reduced the urgency of the investigations. They believed that society and law enforcement had failed to recognize the seriousness of the disappearances quickly enough. For years, advocates in Vancouver had warned that something unusual was happening. Families, community workers, and activists had raised concerns about the growing number of missing women from the downtown east side. They argued that more resources were needed. They questioned why the disappearances were not receiving greater attention. The eventual discovery at the PICKTON farm intensified those criticisms. Many people asked a painful question: could more lives have been saved if authorities had acted sooner? The controversy led to investigations into police handling of the missing women cases. Questions were raised about whether information had been ignored or whether opportunities had been missed. The issue was not only about one criminal. It was also about institutions and how they respond when victims come from marginalized communities. After his arrest, Robert PICKTON remained in custody while prosecutors prepared their case. The evidence against him continued to grow. In 2005, prosecutors charged PICKTON with multiple counts of first-degree murder. The charges involved women who had disappeared from Vancouver's downtown east side. The trial became one of the most significant criminal proceedings in Canadian history. Because of the number of victims and the amount of evidence involved, preparing the case required years of work. The prosecution had to present evidence in a way that demonstrated responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense, meanwhile, challenged the strength and reliability of the evidence. Before the trial began, one major legal issue involved the number of charges that would be heard. The prosecution had initially prepared a much larger case involving many alleged victims. However, the first trial focused on 6 women: Marnie Frey, Mona Wilson, Andrea Josberry, Serena Abotsway, Brenda Wolfe, and Georgina Papine. The decision was made to proceed with a manageable number of charges first. The case involving the remaining victims was not part of that first trial. In January 2006, the trial began in British Columbia Supreme Court. The proceedings attracted enormous media attention. People across Canada followed the case closely. For the families of the victims, however, the trial was not simply a public event. It was a search for justice and recognition for their loved ones. The prosecution presented evidence collected from the PICKTON farm. They argued that the evidence demonstrated that PICKTON was responsible for the deaths of the 6 women. One of the key elements of the prosecution's case involved DNA evidence. Forensic testing connected evidence found on the property to some of the victims. The prosecution argued that these findings created a clear connection between PICKTON and the murders. The defense took a different approach. PICKTON's lawyers argued that the evidence did not prove he was responsible. They questioned the reliability of some evidence and challenged aspects of the investigation. The defense suggested that contamination or mistakes could have affected some findings. Their goal was to create reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors. One of the most significant moments of the trial involved testimony from witnesses connected to PICKTON. The prosecution presented evidence from people who had interacted with him or had knowledge of activities at the farm. Some testimony focused on PICKTON's behavior and statements. Other evidence focused on the events surrounding the victims' disappearances. The trial lasted many months. The jury heard complicated forensic evidence. They listened to witnesses. They examined the arguments from both sides. The case was emotionally difficult because it involved the deaths of multiple women and the suffering experienced by their families. On December 9, 2007, the jury reached a verdict. Robert PICKTON was found guilty of 6 counts of second-degree murder. The jury did not convict him of first-degree murder. Instead, they found that the prosecution had proven that he was responsible for the deaths, but the evidence did not establish all the requirements needed for a first-degree murder conviction. The verdict brought an end to one stage of the case. PICKTON received a life sentence with no possibility of parole for 25 years. However, for many families, the verdict brought complicated emotions. Some felt a sense of justice had been achieved. Others felt that the punishment did not fully represent the scale of the tragedy. Many families were still seeking answers about other missing women. Although PICKTON had been convicted of 6 murders, authorities continued investigating additional cases connected to the farm. Many more women had disappeared, and investigators believed there was evidence linking PICKTON to additional victims. However, those cases were never brought to trial. The legal process ended with the convictions already secured. The case also led to deeper discussions about policing and social inequality. Many people questioned why the disappearances had not received stronger attention earlier. The victims came from a community where many people already faced social challenges. The tragedy highlighted how vulnerable people can sometimes be overlooked. In response to these concerns, the government established the Missing Women Commission of Inquiry. The inquiry examined how police investigated the disappearances and why the cases took so long to receive significant attention. It heard testimony from police officers, government officials, families of victims, and community advocates. The inquiry's findings were released in 2012. The report concluded that there had been serious failures in the police response. It found that investigative decisions were affected by stereotypes and assumptions about the victims. The inquiry made recommendations aimed at improving how missing persons cases are handled, especially involving vulnerable communities. The legacy of the Robert PICKTON case extends far beyond the criminal conviction. It became a symbol of the dangers faced by marginalized people. It raised questions about whose lives receive attention and whose disappearances are taken seriously. It forced institutions to examine their responsibilities. The case also changed how Canadians viewed missing persons investigations. It showed the importance of taking every disappearance seriously, regardless of a person's background, lifestyle, or social status. Every missing person represents a family searching for answers. Every victim represents a life that mattered. Robert PICKTON died in prison in 2024 after being attacked by another inmate. His death ended the life of a man whose name had become associated with one of Canada's darkest criminal cases. But the story of the PICKTON case was never only about him. It was about the women whose lives were lost. It was about families who spent years demanding answers. It was about a community that felt ignored. And it was about the responsibility of society to protect the vulnerable. The PICKTON farm investigation remains one of the largest and most disturbing criminal cases in Canadian history. It exposed failures. It changed conversations, and it left behind a lasting reminder. A person's worth should never depend on their social status, their struggles, or how visible they are to society. The missing women of Vancouver's downtown east side were more than names in an investigation. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends. They had dreams. They had memories. They had people who loved them. And their stories remain the most important part of this tragedy. This was the story of Robert PICKTON, the case that shocked Canada and changed the way the country looked at justice, vulnerability, and accountability.